for having us and for all of you. Certainly to add on to what Ed and Maricelly has said, clearly Benito connects emotionally, and it's obviously a big reason why he is basically an international celebrity and one of the biggest celebrities in the world. And to me, this is an example, at least sonically and emotionally, how his music connects. One thing, just from my personal standpoint, first sonically, is that he's using both, like Jibarito music as well as bomba on the same track. And I can only speak personally, growing up basically the child of Jibarita, that my community was, I'll say this, if you grew up in a Puerto Rican community, the folkloric standard was Jibarito music, right? Now some communities that make sense because if you were a descendant of Boricuas or Locobis, towns that were in La Montaña, that's the music you grew up with, that's your folklore. So that makes total sense. I can think of a kid, that was the standard holiday, cultural connected music. Bomba was very much an afterthought culturally. Some of it's racial, some of it's, hey, this is an Afro-descendant music from Luis Aldea and those communities. And again, if you lived in the mountains, that wasn't your cultural connection per se. So to me, and reggaetoneros in general, but Bad Bunny in particular, to take two musics that are not that have never been or very little been commercially viable, and to be seen as very cultural, folkloric music that's not mainstream, even in Spanish language music, is a pretty significant thing to do, I think, musically. I think Luis Sanz was the name of the cuatrita, the person playing on this record. And then if you see the live show, either PR or the Amazon Prime, there was a brother, Julito Gaston, who's a kid of Luis Aldea, that again, these are examples of musicians that grew up culturally with this music, and to have it on the same record, essentially, sonically to be the same, is almost like speaking one language as normally were two musically. And so I think that's an example of sonically people connecting to it, oh, I'm on the Caribeño side, and that connects to bomba. I would say too, bomba has almost had sort of a resurgence, and I think it seems post Maria. Is that fair to say? Yeah. And I only say this, it might be anecdotal, but if you ever talk to people who are musicians in PR or cultural activists in the U.S., again, Jibarito music tended to be the folklore. But in terms of working at a bar in PR, for the tourists or for the people, hey, people want to dance. You were playing salsa, you were playing merengue, you were doing you're a reggaeton DJ, you're whatever. So it seems like, at least anecdotally, post Hurricane Maria, and now we have sort of the commercial support of Benito and Alejandro, people like that. Well, now you might see bomba groups in a bar playing bomba music, for people to dance to, commercially interact with, and that is a very, almost revolutionary thing. It's more recent. I think lyrics-wise, to talk about, in particular, him referring to things that reflect the gentrification in the island. So, quítame el río y también la playa, to me is sort of musically speaking to both sides of the culture, let's say. And then I think also lyrically is because he's saying, también en la playa really refers to how the gentrification issue, I think what people are connecting to is how PR's beaches are legally public, where anyone can go. It doesn't matter if it's a fancy town or not. You're supposed to be a public beach. But that's been sort of encroached on to some degree, where there's developments, whether it's housing, hotels, whatever, where that Puerto Ricans are now seeing that as increasingly not the case, or they have to push back on these developments that are cutting off their normal routes to access to the beaches. But he says that Rio, I would argue, because the Jibaritos, there's no beaches in Barranquitas and Maricelly. It's again, if someone just goes to PR to vacation, they think of beaches. But my mother didn't even like the beach, for instance. She was more of I want to go to the lake, and I'm not into it. So to me, lyrically, he's speaking to both, two sides of the cultures together. And I think that's part of why emotionally people connect to that record. I'll say too, real quick too, is the reference to Hawaii. And that's always been sort of an independentista argument as to what would happen if statehood did officially get, which I would argue would never happen, but if in theory it were to become a U.S. state, because if you look at some of the real conservative or progressive economic measures of how Native Hawaiians are doing in Hawaii, the higher rates of homelessness, how they were, again, gentrification, being pushed off to the lesser desired islands in Hawaii. You think about Native Hawaiian language is not the language of business, it's not the language of education there, it's not the language of culture. It's very much like, oh, it's a small population that we pushed off the places the other people don't want to live. The cost of living there, the cost of milk. Ever ask someone who lived in Hawaii the cost of milk, for instance? So he's referencing a real, historical example. And as well, the oldest Puerto Rican community outside of PR is Hawaii, because sugarcane migration literally over 100 years ago. But he's literally referencing, like I said, look at PASÓ in Hawaii, because it's a great example of, again, the argument, well, if you let this keep going, what may happen at the end?